One of the most efficient yet ruthless execution methods used throughout history was the guillotine. When the device was brought into fashion in France, the people hated it, as they preferred more brutal and less clinical execution methods, such as the breaking wheel, where someone would be battered to a pulp. But the blade of the guillotine even fell upon the French king and queen, and much of the ruling royal family, during the French Revolution. What is not as well known is that there were different guillotines deployed throughout history in different lands, and all these beheading machines had different variations and tweaks. You might not know that the guillotine took inspiration from medieval English devices, which were used inside of towns to take the head off a condemned person. In this video we will look at the different variations of the guillotine, and those machines used to execute many people in a shocking manner. Welcome to the Fortress. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
But it was during the French Revolution that it was used heavily. Following its invention, it was actually called a Louisette, but was named then after a French physician, Joseph Ignace Guillotine, who gave the idea of performing executions in France in a more humane way. Guillotine himself was against the death penalty, and he did not like the use of the breaking wheel and other barbaric ways of execution, and he convinced King Louis XVI to implement a more humane way. It wasn't Guillotine who made the first structure, as it was Antoine Louis and a German engineer Tobias Schmidt who built a guillotine prototype. But it was claimed that the king himself, Louis XVI, suggested using a straight-angled blade. Ironically, it would be this structure that would then take his life later. Guillotine took to the National Assembly in October 1789, saying that capital punishment should be always done by decapitation in a simple and mechanic way, and then the king banned using the breaking wheel. But within his country there was a growing discontent and uproar against the monarchy, with huge economic problems across France. A committee was formed of French officials, including Antoine Louis and Guillotine, who looked at other European countries to create a more humane device and beheading structure. It was said that the weapon should be used to take the heads off all condemned people, regardless of who they were and what standing they were in society, and that the purpose was to just end life and not cause pain. The prototype that was made looked how we would imagine a guillotine to look like, and the first execution by guillotine occurred with highwayman Nicolas Jacques Pelletier on the 25th of April 1792, being beheaded. This took place in front of the now City Hall of Paris, and it was here where all the condemned citizens were to die, until the scaffold was later moved. The guillotine, it was said, was seen as a successful device, and it was considered much more humane. Before, executioners, often using swords or axes, took many swings to kill the condemned, leading to bloody scenes with people being hacked to death. The family of the condemned even paid executioners more money to make sure they had sharpened his sword or axe sufficiently to take the head off the person in one swift blow. Hanging was also seen as contentious, as it often took people minutes to die, but those calling for revolution did also like to use more barbaric methods, such as burning at the stake. But by using the guillotine and standardising one method of civil execution, it represented equality between all of the citizens of France, which encapsulated the morals of the French Revolution. It was a device that took off the head of the King of France and those of any class. If it was good enough for the King and his Queen, it was seen as good enough for the rest of France. During the Reign of Terror, the guillotine saw heavy use. This took place following the first declaration of the Republic, and a number of public executions took place, in which anyone who opposed the revolution was killed. Between June 1793 and July 1794, around 17,000 were beheaded on the device, including the King and the Queen. Even the leaders of the revolution, such as Maximilien Robespierre, were executed on the guillotine, and most of the executions were carried out at the Place de la Révolution in Paris. The guillotine was found in the corner of the square, and at times it was a form of public entertainment. Large crowds would gather to witness executions at this site, and people even made money from this. Entrepreneurs would sell programs containing the names of those to be killed, but to the French people, the guillotine was more than just an execution device. For them it was a symbol of the revolution, an equality in death, an equality in the eyes of the law. Following the French Revolution, the guillotine was moved and repairs were made to parts of the structure. In the 1900s, it was still being used, and the last public guillotine in France occurred on the 17th of June 1939. Eugène Wiedemann, a man convicted of murdering 6 people, was beheaded at Versailles outside a prison. But at the time it was noted that there was poor behaviour by spectators, and also people began to film and photograph the executions from above, and because of this, the French authorities banned public executions, saying guillotines must be used in private courtyards in prisons. Shockingly, it was still the official method of execution in France until the abolition of the death penalty in 1981, and the final 3 guillotinings took place in 1976 and 1977, carrying out its final beheadings of murderers. But the guillotine was used around the world in many other countries. Many European countries saw the guillotine and also had them built to take the lives of criminals in their lands. It was within Nazi Germany that the device was used heavily to take the heads of those people whom Hitler deemed to have been traitors to his Third Reich. The guillotine was used inside of Nazi Germany following Hitler's seizure of power to 1945, and it's estimated that around 16,500 prisoners were executed using the device. In fact, in 1944 to 1945, as the Second World War turned against the Germans and Hitler's grip on the war loosened, it's estimated that 10,000 people were killed on the guillotine alone within the space of around a year. Famously, Hans and Sophie Scholl, members of the White Rose resistance movement, were executed on the device, and Sophie, it was said, was the bravest person to go to her death on it. After the end of the Second World War, the guillotine was last used in West Germany in 1949, and in East Germany it was used until 1966 by the Stasi, who performed executions using it in secret. But ever since the guillotine was used, there has been controversy as to how humane the device actually is, and how painless death is for those found under the blade. It was certainly seen as entertainment for crowds, which itself is humane, but there have been accounts of those who have been beheaded showing signs of life for moments after decapitation. There has never been any true scientific evidence on this, but there were accounts of the condemned's eyes staring and fixating on the crowd once their head had been cut off. There are accounts of blinkings of the eyes and of eyelids lifting and even lips moving. But whether this was just told as a way of making executions seem more exciting for those telling the stories is disputed. But the guillotine took the heads of thousands of people in Europe since its creation. It was used by many different countries and not just the French or the Germans, and it's up to you whether you deem it to have been the most humane way of execution. In opposition to this, the fact that it is not used today probably disputes that this isn't the case, but for many around the world, it's seen as a symbol of the French Revolution and of the values of liberty, equality and fraternity that encompass the revolution. But for others, it's seen as an instrument of Hitler's regime that was used to quash any resistance to him.
Inside of Germany, the guillotine was known as the Faubile, or the drop axe, and it did differ from the guillotine slightly. It was mostly metal, as a guillotine used in France utilised a wooden frame, but many of the early German Faubiles were the same as the French devices. The German executioners innovated, and they created a smaller metal structure for the execution, and these were said to have required less maintenance, and they were also longer lasting. One device, the Hamburg Faubile, was utilised up until 1933, and this specific device was strange, as it had a blade and a release mechanism, which was slightly different. With this device there was a hole in it, on the scaffold, where the body would be dropped down into the scaffold after the execution, for the body to then be placed in a coffin away from the eyes of many, as the Hamburg Faubile was surrounded by a big wooden shed, giving greater privacy. This was found within the walls of the prison, which was also not public, but when Hitler rose to the position of Chancellor, and also when he seized power, he would order the creation of more Faubiles, and he also would put these execution devices to work. There were thousands over the years of the Third Reich who were executed on the device, and one of the most famous to lose her head on this was Sophie Scholl. She was a member of the brave White Rose movement, and these young resistors were involved in distributing leaflets across Germany, telling people to ignore the lies of the Nazi Party. They would eventually be found, and the White Rose came crashing down. Sophie Scholl, along with her brother Hans, following their arrest, were given over to the Gestapo. They were interrogated and were then tried for treason against the Nazi state. Following a hearing at the People's Court, they were sentenced to death, and Sophie Scholl, the young woman, was to be executed on the Foulbile. She was executed by experienced executioner Johann Reichardt, and he was said to have been the master of the Foulbile, and he would execute 3,000 people himself inside of Hitler's Germany, most of those people who resisted the regime. However, Johann Reichardt claimed that Sophie Scholl was, when she faced her death, the bravest person he ever had to execute. The device used to execute her was actually recently found and can be actually viewed inside of a museum in Bavaria. But there had been other women who were executed on the device before, as Greta Bayer was executed on it decades before Hitler rose to power. She had been condemned for poisoning her fiancé and shooting him, and she did not love this man, but she thought murdering her husband was the easiest way out of her marriage. She was executed on the Foulbile at just the age of 22. Many of those men and women who carried out the executions wore their smartest clothes, and these were gentlemen who were not butchers. They were hated across Germany, as many saw them as legal murderers, but they were men who were said to have been very skilled at using their instrument of death to take the heads off their victims. Some even experimented with their devices, and one was even said to have had a pipe connected to it, so that the blood from the falling blade would then be taken away, would then drain straight into a sewer system. Many of the devices had metal baskets fitted to them, which collected the head of the victim following the fall of the blade, and sand was thrown underneath the device to capture blood, and also sawdust was. These execution devices were slightly smaller than the French guillotine, and the executioners used a metal gliding frame and kept the blade straight when it fell through the guillotine, and this allowed greater reliability as the device fell onto the neck. The blade of the device was also very heavy, meaning when falling at speed, little could go wrong as it sliced through the neck. The executioners working inside of Hitler's prisons could execute prisoners very quickly, and they could take a head off within a matter of seconds of someone entering the execution chamber. The victim would have been secured to a board, and the victim would stand on a footrest as they were then secured and strapped to the board. This would then be quickly slid under the blade, and someone was then locked into place, and the blade would be released and the lever was pulled. The Nazis kept very strict records of executions, and they documented exactly what happened with them. There were some which took just 7 seconds from when someone entered the execution chamber, and a bell rang out throughout the prison, and this told everyone that an execution was occurring. Also inside of the execution chambers, often the execution was performed behind a curtain, adding more privacy for the executioner to conduct his miserable work. Inside of Nazi Germany, executioners were paid roughly 3,000 Reichmarks a year, and they would also be given a bonus of around 65 Reichmarks with each execution, and some became rather rich. They lived in villas and nice houses in the best parts of cities or in the countryside, and the Nazis even charged the families of those who they executed. Every execution cost 300 Reichmarks for the family to pay, and a 12-penny cost was even accounted and collected for the cost of sending the letter to the family. In the years which Hitler was in control of Germany, it's believed that 16,500 people were executed on the German guillotine, and it was said to have been a very efficient way for Hitler to get rid of his enemies. It was a rough thing for many, and most people in Germany knew of someone who had lost their head on the device. One doctor even said what was worse was a trip to the dentist, which was said to have been more painful than execution using the Foulbile. But there were very few limits to the brutality of the device. The 17-year-old Herbert Hubener became the youngest person executed by the Nazis. He was 17 years old, and he questioned the Nazis in his writing and pamphlets, and he claimed in one of these, "German boys, do you know the country without freedom, the country of terror and tyranny? Yes, you know it well, but are afraid to talk about it. They have intimidated you to such an extent that you don't dare talk for fear of reprisal. Yes, you are right. It is Germany, Hitler's Germany. Through their unscrupulous terror tactics against young and old, men and women, they have succeeded in making you spineless puppets to do their bidding." Of course, for the Nazis, they believed this was treason, and with this Hubener, despite being a teenager, was executed on the Foulbile. This took place on the 27th of October 1942, and at 8:13 p.m. in the evening the blade fell upon his neck, and his final words to the judges at his trial were, "Now I must die, even though I have committed no crime, so now it is my turn, but your turn will come." The foul bile was used at the end of the Second World War, and there were some accounts of the Allies using the device to execute war criminals in Germany after the conflict had come to an end. There were a few who were killed on the device under German courts, despite usually gallows being used inside of prisons for war criminals. The British utilised the device to execute people condemned by German law. However, within some of the most brutal prisons of the Third Reich, the foul bile was used often, and each week the device was being used to take the head of those people who were dissenting or resisting. They were even taken to occupied lands such as Czechoslovakia, where inside of prisons many Czech people who resisted the German occupation were slaughtered and killed on the foul bile. But what cannot be forgotten was the execution device, which became popular during the French Revolution, was borrowed by the Third Reich and by Hitler and was adapted to become more ruthless. It had a long history inside of Germany, as executioners looked to their neighbours for inspiration with the execution device, but Hitler's skilled set of executioners could take a head off in around 10 seconds from the point where they entered the execution chamber. Anyone who dissented would face the ultimate sentence, and they often lost their lives resting their necks under the slanted blade of the foul bile.
The right to have a gibbet was given to Halifax allegedly around the time of the Norman conquest of 1066. A law known as the Halifax Gibbet Law would give the Lord of the Manor of Wakefield the power to try and execute those criminals who had stolen goods to the value of 13.5p or more. It said, if a felon be taken within their liberty or precincts of the said forest, carrying stolen goods to the value of 13.5p, that they shall after 3 market days of meeting days within the town of Halifax after such his apprehension, and being condemned, it shall be taken to the gibbet, and there have his head cut off from his body. This may have originated around the time of King Henry III, who gave many rights to local lords of the manor John de Warenne. Within Yorkshire itself in 1278, there were 94 different privately owned gibbets and gallows used in the county. Suspected thieves would be kept in custody of the Lord of the Manor's bailiff, and he would summon a jury of 16 local men, who were sought to be the most wealthy and the best reputed from the local townships. The jury had to decide upon 2 questions. Were the stolen goods found in the possession of the accused, and were they worth at least 13.5p? The jury would gather in a room at the bailiff's house and no oaths would be taken. The jury would just decide guilty or innocent. The law was applied rather forcefully and was aimed to deter the public from stealing. Before the execution of a condemned person, they would usually be kept in prison for 3 market days, and on each of these were placed in the stocks and shown besides the goods they had stolen. Local people would then administer some justice by throwing and abusing those inside the stocks. After an execution would have taken place, another jury was assembled and would then give a detailed account of the execution. Interestingly, the punishment would be carried out within the boundary of the Forest of Hardwick, and the gibbet was only around 500 yards from the boundary line. This meant that a condemned person who would have been brought to the gibbet could escape and run around 460 metres inside the forest, and could then be freed, as they could not legally be brought back over the boundary for their punishment. This happened at least twice, when 2 men cheated the executioner. One would never be seen again, but another would foolishly return back to Halifax, and was then captured and executed. The earliest accounts of a decapitation in Halifax was John of Dalton, who was killed in 1286. However, official records were not kept until after 1538. Between 1538 and 1650, a number of executions using decapitation took place. It was mostly believed that it was for thieves, however a number of other criminals could have been killed using the Halifax gibbet. It wasn't certain when the gibbet was first introduced, but before then executions would have taken place using an axe. The Halifax gibbet was unique in England. It was made up of 2 15-foot tall beams of wood, joined at the top by a beam. A square wooden block ran in between the grooves, and on the bottom of the wood was an axe head which weighed around 7 pounds. A rope was attached to the top of the wooden block that would hold the axe over a pulley system. Interestingly, the axe blade of the Halifax gibbet was never sharpened. The weight of the axe and the heavy blade falling onto the neck of the criminal would then cause the head to be taken clean off. The gibbet could be used by cutting the rope or pulling out the pin that held the rope. Sometimes if a thief had stolen an animal, a cord would be attached to the pin, which could then be attached to an animal stolen or one like it. The animal would then be driven away and the pin would come out and the blade would then drop. The device was known for being an efficient execution method, that at the fall of the axe the head would then roll. Between the time when records began in Halifax and the area and 1650, a total of 56 men and women were recorded to have been decapitated, mostly assumed killed by the Halifax gibbet. The final victims of the gibbet were Abraham Wilkinson and Anthony Mitchell. Wilkinson had been caught stealing 16 yards of cloth, and 9 yards were found in his possession, which was valued at least 9 shillings. Mitchell, on the other hand, was accused of stealing and selling 2 horses, one valued at 9 shillings, the other valued at 48 shillings, which was a huge amount of money. Both of the two were found guilty by their juries and were to be executed on the same day, the 30th of April 1650. In the 19th century, the remains of the Halifax gibbet's base were discovered, and in the area were also the remains of 2 men's skeletons, who had died from having their heads severed. It's assumed that these belonged to Wilkinson and Mitchell. A few accounts of the gibbet would state, during the first implementation in 1286 and the last implementation in 1650, approximately 100 people were beheaded. However, due to the uncertain date and installation of the gallows, it's not possible to accurately determine how many were executed by the Halifax gibbet. In 1650, the public believed that it was an excessively harsh punishment for a thief. It was said when an execution happened, the person who had found the verdict and the attending clergyman placed themselves on the scaffold with the prisoner. The 4th psalm was then played around the scaffold on the bagpipes, after which the minister prayed with the prisoner until he received the final stroke. Oliver Cromwell would stop the use of the Halifax gibbet in 1650, a year after the final executions, and the gibbet was dismantled. It was against Cromwell's Puritan beliefs that the death penalty should be imposed upon those who were guilty of theft. The site of the gibbet was left neglected for a long time, until a full-size non-working replica was erected on the original stone base in 1974. On this is a blade made from the casing of the original, and a commemorative plaque can be found nearby for those 50-odd people who were known to have been killed by the gibbet. The guillotine in France was seen as a revolutionary device that came out of a need for people to execute thousands very quickly. It was seen as a symbol of the French Revolution. However, it's interesting to consider that hundreds of years earlier, the same sort of device could be found within England. Interestingly, also, it did differ from the Halifax gibbet. For example, the use of an axe blade rather than a sharp slanted blade to effectively cut off heads. Even the Nazis would use the guillotine during their reign of terror over Europe, but in a Yorkshire town in England, it would be pioneered and used. What is harsh though is the strict laws on theft that led to the deaths of dozens at the hands of the gibbet. One person could escape their fate though. If they did manage to run off less than a mile towards the boundary, they would escape with their lives. The maiden was an execution device which was used in Scotland between the 1500s and 1700s, mostly in Edinburgh. It was a device which was introduced in 1564 during the reign of Mary Queen of Scots, and its final use was in 1716. It was a device which came a long time before the guillotine, and the maiden was built in Edinburgh and was made of oak, and on it was a lead weight and also an iron blade. Machines like this were not new, and there were other examples in Britain, for example the Halifax gibbet. By 1563 in Scotland, the sword which was used for executions in the capital was worn out, and then money was used to pay for the loan of a sword for beheadings. So the Scots, when they wanted to execute someone using sword, would pay to borrow an executioner's sword to perform the job, rather than to simply make their own. But after this, the provosts and magistrates of Edinburgh conceived the idea of the maiden, and it was constructed to become a reliable and cheap method of execution. The original maiden was made by Adam and Patrick Shang and George Todd. A blacksmith, Andrew Gotterson, added the lead weight on the blade after the other men had made the frame. They were paid for their work, and Shang was interestingly the maker of some of the royal furniture. But the time then came for the first execution using the maiden. The first life and head claimed by the device was that of Thomas Scott of Cambus Michael, who made his way to the device in Edinburgh on the 3rd of April 1565. There were funds allocated for moving the parts of the maiden from Blackfriars in Edinburgh to the town's cross, where the execution would be carried out. The different parts could be collapsed easily and then dismantled for storage when the time came around, but the executions using the maiden took place at the Mercat Cross in Edinburgh, and also on Castle Hill and the Grassmarket near to Edinburgh Castle. The device could be lent and moved, and this happened in 1591, when Leif needed the device to execute William Gibson. But one of the most high-profile victims of the maiden was the regent James Douglas IV, Earl of Morton, who helped to rule the country during the minority of King James VI. Douglas had fallen from grace, and he was then taken to Edinburgh for his execution on the 30th of May 1581. He was kept on the Royal Mile, 100 metres from the maiden and his execution site, and he would be executed 3 days later. The blade of the maiden fell and took Douglas's head clean off, and it was said to have been clean work, but following his death his corpse was left at the foot of the maiden on the scaffold for a day to act as a warning. His head was placed on a spike high above Edinburgh. Some historians have claimed that it was the 4th Earl of Morton who brought the device to Scotland, having seen it work in a similar way in Yorkshire with the Halifax gibbet in operation, taking the heads of serious criminals, yet he would lose his head on the device. In its time in operation, which was roughly a century and a half, over 150 people were executed on the maiden. Archibald Campbell, the first Marquess of Argyll, lost his head on it, as did his son who shared the same name as him. They are probably the only father and son combination to lose their heads on the same device, but both were executed for being rebellious. The last execution on the maiden took place on the 30th of June 1716, and John Hamilton was beheaded on it as he was convicted of murdering a pub owner. Following this execution, the maiden was then stored away, and it can still be seen today. But the way the maiden worked was similar to the guillotine. The executed person would place their head on the crossbar of the device, which was around 4 feet from the bottom. Then lead weights were attached to the axe blade. The blade would be guided through grooves cut from the frame. A peg was attached to a cord, and this kept the blade locked in place before the executioner would decide when it was time for the execution to take place, and then he would take out the peg, and this would cause the blade to fall and take the head off the condemned. Shockingly, sometimes, if a criminal was linked to animal theft, the executioners would attach the animal to the cord, and when they were driven off, the blade would fall. But the maiden was an execution device which would inspire the guillotine in France, which would take the lives of thousands. The guillotine and the maiden had a number of similarities, including the frame, and also the way the blade fell and took the head clean off. But the guillotine would be a device which would take the heads of the French King Louis XVI and his Queen Marie Antoinette, as well as many different politicians and key figures. But the Scots would get rid of the maiden in the early 18th century, but the specific device of the Edinburgh maiden would take over 100 people's lives, and their heads would be placed high above the castle and in other structures and gates around the Scottish capital. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.